The third cot collapsed under Darian's patient before she could get the clamp on, and the Turai soldier hit the deck plates with a sound like wet kindling snapping. Feathers everywhere, bronze and ash gray, torn loose by the blast that had opened the station's port gallery to vacuum 3 hours ago. The emergency membrane had sealed the breach, but the shrapnel had done its work first, and now the triage bay that had once been the Turai orbital station's botanical atrium was a landscape of broken plumage and blood that ran the color of dark copper. "Cot's gone," Darian said, already dragging a cargo pallet into position. She didn't wait for help. There was no help, she was the help. 40 minutes ago, she'd been running a routine vaccination audit on the lower ring of Vain-Korath Station, the kind of assignment Earth's Interstellar Medical Corps handed to paramedics who'd pulled too many consecutive combat rotations and needed what the service called a decompression post. 4 months on an Allied Turai station, administering boosters to avian dockworkers, filing supply manifests, drinking the fermented nectar the Turai brewed in their off-shifts. Easy duty. Safe duty. Then the ceiling had come down. She'd been in the pharmacy annex when the first salvo hit 3 armor-piercing rounds from a Geddon Raider flotilla that had dropped out of transit less than 1,200 kilometers from the station's unshielded flank. The Turai were not a martial species. They were scholars, archivists, atmospheric engineers. Their station had defensive emitters rated for micrometeorite deflection. Against a Geddon hunting party, the emitters had lasted 9 seconds. Darian had felt the deck lurch, heard the shriek of hull separation, and started moving before the alarms caught up. She'd grabbed her emergency kit from the pharmacy locker, the one she'd stocked herself the first week, because 4 combat rotations had taught her that official kit was always missing something, and followed the sound of screaming. She'd been following it ever since. The Turai soldier on the cargo pallet was young, his crest feathers still soft and half-formed, the iridescent blue of adolescence not yet faded to the bronze of full maturity. A fragment had entered under his left wing joint and lodged somewhere near his keel bone. His breathing was a shallow, rapid clicking, and his 3-fingered hands kept trying to fold his wings inward, a reflexive self-shielding posture that was tearing the wound wider every time he moved. "Hold still." Darian pinned his wing flat with her forearm and used her teeth to tear open a hemostatic pack. The Turai coagulant she'd been given during orientation was somewhere in the pharmacy annex, which was now in hard vacuum. Human hemostatic granules weren't designed for Turai blood chemistry, but copper-based or iron-based, blood was blood when it was leaving the body fast enough. She packed the wound, applied pressure, and counted. 20 seconds, the bleeding slowed. Not stopped Turai coagulation was different, slower to initiate, harder to sustain, but slowed enough that the hemostatic granules were buying time. "You," she said to the Turai woman hovering 3 meters away, clutching a child against her chest plumage. The child's eyes wide, amber, unblinking tracked Darian's hands with the focus of something that had evolved from raptors. "What's your name?" "Aerith Sal." The woman's voice was a trembling harmonic, 2 vocal cords producing a chord instead of a note. "Aerith Sal, I need you to keep pressure on this dressing. Both hands, don't let go until I come back. Can you do that?" The woman stared at her. Darian recognized the look. She'd seen it in a dozen species across 3 conflicts. The look that said, "I don't understand why you're calm. I need a yes or a no." "Yes." "Good." Darian guided the woman's hands into position, checked that the pressure was adequate, and moved to the next patient. The atrium had been converted to triage less than 20 minutes into the attack, when the Turai station commander, a tall, gaunt female named Korathven, whose crest feathers were silver with age, and whose bearing suggested she had once been something more than a station administrator, had directed all casualties to the only section with intact atmospheric seals and gravity plating, the botanical gardens. The place where the Turai grew their ceremonial seedlings and their medicinal vines, where dappled artificial sunlight filtered through canopy glass, and the air smelled of pollen and chlorophyll. Now the seedlings were trampled. The canopy glass was cracked in 3 places with emergency sealant hissing into the gaps, and the pollen smell was buried under copper blood and ozone, and the acrid tang of burned feathers. Darian had counted 41 casualties in the first sweep. 41 Turai ranging from dockworkers to archivists to children, laid out in rows on the atrium floor because the cots had run out after the first 12. She'd triaged them using the system Earth's core had drilled into her: immediate, delayed, minimal, expectant. She'd used a grease pencil from her kit to mark foreheads because the Turai didn't wear wristbands and their feathers shed adhesive tags: green for minimal, yellow for delayed, red for immediate. She did not use black. She refused to use black. The 4th patient was a dockworker, broad-shouldered, his wing feathers clipped short in the style of manual laborers who worked in tight crawl spaces. A structural beam had fallen across his lower body, and his right leg was shattered in at least 2 places. He was conscious, which made it worse. He could see what Darian could see. The leg was rotated at an angle that no intact bone could account for. "I'm going to splint this," she told him. She'd already improvised her first 3 splints from metal shelving pulled off the atrium walls. Now the shelving was out of reach and she didn't want to leave the patient. The planting trellises, thin composite bars designed to support vines, were within arm's reach. She snapped 2 loose, tested their rigidity. They'd hold. She talked to the dockworker as she worked. Steady, specific, no empty reassurance but no silence either. "This is going to hurt, but it's going to stabilize the fracture. I need you to breathe. Don't hold your breath. Breathe in through your beak, out through your nostrils. Good. Again." She set the splint. He screamed a high, piercing tone that cut through the atrium like a blade. 3 other patients flinched. A child across the room buried its face deeper into its mother's chest plumage. Darian kept her hands where they were, steady and exact, while the sound washed over her and through her and out the other side. "Breathe good. The worst part is done." It wasn't, but he didn't need to know that yet. She checked distal circulation. The clawed toes were warm, responsive. The splint would hold. She marked his forehead yellow and moved on. The 5th patient changed the calculus. A Turai child, small 5 or 6 in their developmental terms, still downy-feathered, bones still hollow enough that a hard fall could fracture them. A piece of shrapnel the length of Darian's index finger was embedded in the child's upper thigh, and the tissue had swollen tight enough to hide the metal. The child wasn't crying. Turai children cried persistently and loudly. Silence meant either shock deep enough to suppress the response or pain beyond the crying threshold. Darian knelt beside the child and looked at the mother Erithsal, still holding pressure on the soldier's wound with one hand and clutching her older child with the other. Their eyes met. The terror in the mother's face transcended species. "I need to remove the fragment," Darian said. "If I leave it, the tissue will necrose around the metal." "Can you? Is there something for pain?" Darian's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. Her anesthetic supply was a single vial of lidocaine analog, formulated for human patients. She'd checked during orientation. Turai physiology rejected human analgesic compounds. The neural pathway differences between avian-descended and mammalian-descended nervous systems meant that what numbed human tissue had no effect on Turai tissue and could, in some concentrations, cause paradoxical hypersensitivity. "No," she said. "Nothing I have will work on Turai physiology. I need someone to hold the child still." She looked for Korath Ven. The station commander was already moving toward them, having heard the exchange from across the atrium. "I need you to hold a retractor," Darian said to her. "I have never." "I'll show you. 2 seconds to learn. You hold it where I put it and don't move until I say." Korath Ven's hands were shaking as Darian placed the instrument. still shaking when Darian made the incision. Still shaking when Darian used the tip of her forceps to locate the fragment 7 centimeters of jagged alloy, deeper than it had appeared from outside. But the hands did not move from where Darian had placed them. The child screamed. Erithsal screamed with her, a harmonic duet that filled the atrium with a sound that would stay in Darian's memory longer than the blood. The other patients went silent. The dockworker stopped groaning and watched. One of the archivists pressed her wings over her ear openings and turned away. Darian's hands did not shake. They had not shaken on the transport deck of the Corin Roman IV evacuation, where she'd worked under mortar fire for 11 hours. They had not shaken in the field hospital at Sevens Ridge, where she'd lost 4 patients in 20 minutes and saved the next 8. They did not shake now. She extracted the fragment, packed the wound, sutured it with the last of her fine-gauge sutures and dressed it. The child's screaming faded to whimpers, then to the rapid breathing of exhaustion. Pulse, strong, steady, faster than she'd like but not dangerously so. Yellow pencil mark, move on. That was when the station took the second hit. 2 of the 3 Geddon raiders had peeled off after the initial bombardment to chase the Turai cargo hauler that had broken free from the far ring dock. The third was holding position 600 meters off the damaged port side, and every 40 minutes it fired a single precision round into a different section of the hull. Not trying to destroy the station, trying to bleed it, punching new holes that overwhelmed the emergency membranes and forced the crew to seal off another section, compressing the survivors into a smaller and smaller volume. This round hit the lower gallery. The deck plates jumped. The canopy glass flexed and a new crack spiderwebbed across the eastern panel. Sealant deployed, but the bead was thinner than the last one. The system was running dry. 2 decorative lanterns crashed down, scattering sparks across the trampled seedlings. Darian shielded the patient she was working on with her body, felt a shard of lantern glass slice the back of her hand, ignored it. Status, she called out. Korethven was at the cracked display terminal. Section Vein 7 has lost pressure. Emergency membranes are holding, but the corridor to secondary water reclamation is gone. How many sections do we have left? This one, crew quarters directly below. The airlock corridor connecting them, that is everything. Darian processed this. She was redressing a wound on a Turai archivist, a smoke-gray feathered woman who'd been watching Darian's hands with bewilderment rather than fear. The water reclamation we just lost, that's where the purification stores were. Yes. How much saline substitute do I have left? What you already compounded, perhaps 2 liters. 2 liters, 41 patients. 11 immediate category, the ones most likely to need fluid resuscitation. 2 liters might cover 4 of them, conservatively. Darian was not in a position to be conservative. She recalculated. The elder patient 16, the white-crested male found clutching a data archive, needed every drop she could spare. His metabolic suppression was buying time, but when it broke, his blood pressure would crash without fluid support. Erithsal. The woman looked up from the soldier's wound, where her pressure was still firm and her hands were steady. She'd learned. I need you to go to crew quarters below us, through the corridor, down the access ladder. Bring every container of drinking water you can carry. The corridors are pressurized. Korethven confirmed it. You'll hear hissing at the membrane junction, but the path is safe. I need the water to compound more IV fluid. Erithsal looked at her sleeping child, made a decision in the space of a breath, transferred the child to the archivist's arms. The smoke-gray woman accepted without question, as if she'd been waiting to be given something to hold, and went. Patient 11 was bleeding again. A Turai maintenance tech whose scalp laceration had soaked through its dressing. Darian changed the bandage, torn bedsheets now, strips cut from the crew quarters by a Turai engineer who'd been hauling them up in bundles. Not sterile. Nothing was sterile at this point, But Tori copper-based blood chemistry was inherently bacteriostatic, which meant the infection window was wider than it would be in a human patient. Get through the acute phase, control the bleeding, maintain the airway, support the circulation. Infection was tomorrow's problem. Patient 14 had developed a complication. The Tori atmospheric engineer whose broken ribs Darian had strapped 2 hours ago was now having difficulty breathing shallow, labored inhalations that produced a wet crackling sound Darian recognized immediately. The rib fractures had shifted, and a fragment was pressing on one of the air sacs. Not a full puncture, not yet, but the sac was compressed enough to reduce her respiratory capacity by at least a third. Darian repositioned the strapping, shifting the compression angle to relieve the pressure on the air sac. It helped. The engineer's breathing eased, the crackling diminished. Not a permanent fix required imaging and possibly surgical intervention, but it would hold. She checked the engineer's oxygen saturation by pressing a finger to the thin skin of her throat where the jugular analog ran close to the surface, counting the pulse, assessing the color of the blood visible through the translucent tissue. Copper blood turned darker when deoxygenated, lighter when oxygenated. The color was acceptable. She adjusted the strapping one more time and moved on. Patient 22 was the air sac case. The Tori respiratory system was nothing like a human's. Where humans had 2 lungs on a bellows principle, Tori had 9 interconnected air sacs providing continuous unidirectional airflow across the gas exchange surfaces. Efficient, evolved for thin cliff habitat atmospheres, but fragile. A puncture to a single air sac could cascade collapse the network and suffocate the patient in minutes. Patient 22 had a penetrating left thorax wound, 2 sacs compromised. One had self-sealed with a lymphan blood clot. The other was leaking, the escaping air accumulating in the pleural space, compressing the remaining sacs and pushing the tracheal column sideways. Tension pneumothorax. In a human, Darian would have decompressed the chest with a large bore needle in 30 seconds. Tori anatomy was different. Air sacs positioned differently, intercostal spaces narrower, the keel bone complicating the approach angle. She'd covered Tori emergency anatomy exactly once, in a 2-hour orientation lecture on her 3rd day. She'd taken notes because 4 combat rotations had taught her that one day those notes would matter. This was the day. She cut a length of medical tubing from her kit, one of the last intact pieces. Tore a finger from a surgical glove and fashioned a one-way flutter valve, taping it to the tube. She identified the insertion point by palpation, the gap between the keel bone and the 3rd rib analog. Then hold her shoulder, don't let her move. The station commander gripped the patient's shoulder. The atmospheric engineer, an older female, semi-conscious, her breathing a thin whistle audible from a meter away. Darian inserted the tube. The hiss of escaping air was immediate. Pressurized gas rushing through the tube and out the valve, smelling of copper and methane. The patient's breathing deepened within seconds, the whistle replaced by a stronger rhythm as the compressed sacs re-expanded. Darian taped the tube in place, checked the valve, marked the forehead red. Immediate, stable, but the improvised valve wouldn't hold indefinitely. She needed a proper chest tube, a proper seal, a proper drainage system. She had none of them. Move on. The 40-minute round hit again. A single impact, this time against the upper hull. The canopy glass rattled, and a strip of sealant popped loose from a previous crack. Then patched it with adhesive tape from Darian's kit, while Darian held pressure on a wound that had reopened from the vibration. "They are hurting us," Then said, her voice flat with understanding. "A technique used on migration flocks, compress the group, exhaust the defenders. Wait." "Wait for what?" "For us to stop moving." Darian looked at her. Silver-crested, formal, robe stained with the copper blood of her own people. The only person in the room besides Darian, who had not sat down in 3 hours. "I don't stop moving," Darian said. She went to check the elder. Patient 16 was slipping. The white-crested elder had a penetrating abdominal wound that should have killed him within 10 minutes of the blast. 3 hours later, he was alive because Turai metabolic rates dropped in response to trauma, an evolutionary adaptation from cliff-nesting prey species, whose only defense was to play dead so convincingly their heartbeat became nearly undetectable. He wasn't playing dead. He was dying slowly, and the metabolic suppression was making it slower. Darian adjusted his IV drip, the irrigation tube line running mineral supplement saline she'd compounded from the station's purification stores and the botanical lab's growing medium. The electrolyte balance was approximate. The osmolarity was wrong. The temperature was ambient, but it was fluid, and fluid was the only thing between his blood pressure and zero. She talked to him. She wasn't sure he could hear her, but she'd learned early in emergency medicine that a calm voice changed something in a patient's physiology no instrument could measure. "The archive is right beside you," she said. "On the shelf. When you wake up, you can finish what you were reading." She wasn't sure he would wake up. She said it anyway. Erithsal returned with 4 sealed bottles and a small storage tank, carried down the access ladder and back with wings trembling from exertion. She set them down without a word and went to reclaim her child. Darian compounded more saline. She'd memorized the mineral ratio from the label on the first compound. Her hands reproduced it automatically. 2 liters became 6. Not enough. Better than 2. She redistributed the fluid among the 3 patients who needed it most, repacked dressings, rechecked the dockworker's splint. Patient 30 was a navigation tech who'd been in the port gallery during the vacuum breach, exposed to hard vacuum for 9 seconds, long enough for dissolved blood gases to expand. Subcutaneous emphysema, pockets of gas trapped under the skin, distending tissue, compressing vessels. Her skin crackled under Darian's fingers like packing material. No field treatment for this. A hospital would use a hyperbaric chamber. On the atrium floor, Darian positioned the patient to minimize gas migration, applied compression bandages, splinted a fracture she'd nearly missed under the emphysema, dressed a scalp laceration. Yellow mark. Patient 34 was a records clerk whose left hand had been crushed in a doorway that had emergency sealed on it. 3 fingers were mangled beyond field repair. Darian cleaned the wounds, debrided the tissue that was clearly non-viable, dressed what remained, and fashioned a protective splint from a piece of the irrigation control panel's casing that she'd pried loose. The clerk watched her work with an expression that was not pain, was past a certain threshold now, a background constant but something more like fascination. "You are very fast," the clerk said. "I've had practice." "How much practice?" Darian finished the splint. "Enough that I don't think about it anymore. The hands know what to do, I just make sure they have what they need." Patient 37 was a child who'd been hit by a falling light fixture, a laceration across the scalp that bled profusely, as scalp wounds always did, regardless of species. The child's mother had wrapped it in a piece of ceremonial cloth, which was the wrong thing to do. The fabric was woven with metallic threads that were contaminating the wound, but Darian understood. You used what you had. You used what was closest. You did what your body told you to do when your child was bleeding. She replaced the ceremonial cloth with a clean bedsheet strip, irrigated the wound with the purified water Erithsal had brought, closed it with adhesive strips because she'd run out of sutures entirely. The adhesive strips were butterfly closures from her kit, the last 8 she had. She used 4 on this wound and pocketed the remaining 4, because somewhere in the next 20 minutes there would be another wound that needed closing, and 4 was better than 0. The smoke-gray archivist caught her arm as she passed. A gentle touch, barely making contact with Darian's blood-soaked sleeve. "You are not Turai," the archivist said. "No." You are the human medical officer, the one who gives injections in the lower ring. That's me. Why are you doing this? Darian looked at her. The archivist's deep amber eyes were clear and steady despite the sutured gash across her own scalp. Because you're hurt, Darian said. That's the whole answer. She moved on. The 41st patient was the hardest. Not medically, the hardest had been the air sac decompression, but this one she'd carry. Patient 41 was a Turai child, younger than the first, barely past fledgling stage. Found under a collapsed storage rack in the engineering bay by a maintenance worker who had carried her to the atrium in his arms, his own crest feathers singed and his left hand burned through to the bone. Darian had treated the worker first. Triage was triage. His burn was immediate priority, then turned to the child. A crush injury to the left wing. The delicate bones compressed and fractured by the rack's weight. In a young Turai, wing bones were still developing mineral structure, still transitioning from the hollow, flexible fledgling state to the rigid, strong state of maturity. The fractures were comminuted, multiple fragments visible under the skin, and the wing would almost certainly never achieve full flight capability even with optimal surgical reconstruction. Darian said it anyway. She said it by feel, palpating through the skin, repositioning fragments until they sat in what felt like anatomical alignment. She'd handled avian-descended skeletal injuries on 2 previous postings, never Turai specifically, but the biomechanical principles were close enough. She used the last of her medical tape and strips of greenhouse film from the botanical supplies to fashion a stabilization wrap. She built a sling from a torn bedsheet, securing the wing against the child's body. The child whimpered but didn't scream. Bravery, exhaustion, or the edge of metabolic suppression, Darian couldn't tell. She marked the forehead yellow, stroked the downy crest feathers once, and did not allow herself to think about the wing. Patient 16 was slipping further. Pulse, a thread 60 seconds between beats. The saline wasn't enough. He needed surgery. A table, a team, blood products, equipment that existed somewhere in the galaxy but not in this atrium. Not today. Darian stayed with him, adjusted the drip, talked to him about the archive, about the seedlings, about the station's atmospheric systems that she'd been learning about during her posting, about anything that wasn't the truth, which was that she was watching a patient die slowly in front of her, and the only thing preventing it was a mineral supplement drip running through garden hose at a ratio she'd guessed from a label. The station shuddered. Not the 40-minute round, different. A vibration rising from the lower decks like a standing wave, deep, resonant, strong enough to rattle the lanterns and set the remaining seedlings trembling. Not destructive, not ordnance, structural, something large making controlled contact with the hull, magnetic clamps engaging, docking seals pressurizing. Korath Ven's crest feathers fanned wide, then flattened. She crossed to the display terminal, pulled up the external sensor feed, a single surviving camera on the upper ring. She made a sound Darian had never heard from a Turai. A low, involuntary harmonic in 2 registers simultaneously, like a chord struck on an instrument nobody had played in 100 years. Darian crossed to the screen. The Geddon Raider was gone, no debris field. Gone running, drive signature fading at extreme range, accelerating out system on a vector that would clear the sector in 20 minutes. In the space where the Raider had been, ships. Not a ship, ships. A Condor-class rapid response cutter, Earth's interstellar medical corps, white-tan dread livery, already docked against the secondary airlock. Behind it at 300 meters, a Herring-class hospital ship, city block-sized, hull studded with surgical bays, recovery wards, biocontainment units. Name on the hull visible through the cracked feed, Resolute Mercy. Behind the hospital ship in loose escort, a supply tender, cargo bays open, shuttle pods already deploying. A fleet tug, tow cables extending toward the damaged port section. And at the outer edge of the formation, turning slowly to present its broadside to the void, a frigate, weapons arrays powered, point defense grid active, standing between the station and anything that might return. 5 ships, for a station that had never managed to send a distress signal. How, Korathvin whispered. The cargo hauler, the Turai vessel that broke free during the attack. It must have reached a relay buoy, a fragment of a message. Position, hostile contact, station damaged. And Earth's Medical Corps, which prepositioned rapid response units at relay junctions for this exact contingency, had heard it. They had not sent a cutter. They had sent a cutter, a hospital ship, a supply tender, a fleet tug, and a warship. Everything. They had sent everything. The secondary airlock cycled, boots on deck plating, many sets, measured, unhurried, professional. The sound of people who had done this before and would do it again and were not wasting energy on visible urgency, because urgency was for amateurs and speed was for professionals and professional speed was quiet. First through the atrium door, a woman in the Interstellar Medical Corps field uniform, trauma surgeon by collar insignia. Behind her, a surgical nurse, an anesthesiologist, a logistics tech carrying a portable field surgery unit that deployed in 90 seconds. Behind them, more teams spreading through the corridor with the choreography of a relief operation rehearsed 1,000 times. The surgeon scanned the atrium in one sweep. 41 patients on the floor, grease pencil codes on foreheads, bedsheet bandages, trellis splints, a flutter valve chest tube from a surgical glove, fluid lines of irrigation tubing, gardening shears in the belt of a blood-soaked paramedic kneeling beside an elderly Turai, adjusting a drip with hands that did not shake. You're the paramedic on the vaccination rotation. Darian didn't look up. Yes, ma'am. Casualties. 41, 11 immediate priority at initial triage, all 11 stabilized, no expectant tags. The surgeon looked across the atrium. 41 patients in neat rows, each bandaged, splinted, dressed, breathing. Green marks, yellow marks, red marks. No black. All 41 with a field kit. Kit ran out after patient 6. After that, I used what the station had. Which was bedsheets, planting trellises, gardening shears, greenhouse film, irrigation tubing, mineral supplements, and a grease pencil. A beat. The shears are better than trauma scissors for Turai flight muscle fascia. The surgeon nodded once, turned to her team. The machine engaged. Darian had been part of relief operations before, never on the receiving side. She stepped back and watched as the cutter's teams moved through her patients with a speed and precision that made her 3 hours of improvisation look like field medicine from a previous century. Portable surgical suites unfolded. Anesthetic compounds calibrated for Turai physiology appeared from cases packed for this species, this sector, this contingency. Blood products copper-based, temperature-matched, species-compatible, flowed through proper IV lines. Hemostatic agents formulated for avian coagulation. Chest tube kits with anatomically correct insertion guides. Splinting materials engineered for hollow bone. And analgesic compounds that worked on Turai neural pathways, so the patients who had endured Darian's treatments in silence or screaming could finally stop hurting. They had brought everything she hadn't had. Every supply she'd exhausted, every instrument she'd substituted, every compound she'd approximated. Packed in cases labeled by species and injury type, organized by priority, cross-referenced with the station's crew manifest pulled from the relay buoy data before the ships arrived. They had known who was on the station, known the species, packed accordingly, and sent 3 times the supplies required, because Earth's Medical Corps didn't pack for the problem they expected. They packed for the problem they feared. The elder went to surgery first. 2 surgeons, an anesthesiologist, a Turai anatomy specialist from the hospital ship's research division. They opened Darian's pressure dressing, assessed the damage, began operating with the focused calm she recognized, the same thing she'd been doing for 3 hours, with better tools. "Your fluid line," one said without looking up. "The mineral compound, what ratio?" Darian told her. "Remarkably close to correct. Where did you learn Turai blood chemistry?" "Didn't. I read the label on the mineral supplements and matched the electrolyte profile to what I remembered from orientation." The surgeon paused one beat, went back to work. The child with the crushed wing was next. The team assessed Darian's trellis and greenhouse film stabilization, imaged the fractures with a portable scanner. The lead surgeon studied the images for a long time. "You set the fragments in anatomical alignment, without imaging." I palpated through the skin. Avian descended bone structure is similar across the species I've worked with. The fragment positions felt wrong, so I repositioned them until they felt right. They were right, within 2 millimeters on all 6 fracture lines. The reconstructive team is cautiously optimistic about partial flight function. Darian didn't say anything. She'd assumed the wing was gone. She'd said it anyway because leaving things undone wasn't something her hands knew how to do. 2 millimeters, 6 fracture lines, by feel in a ruined atrium with no imaging, no anesthetic and greenhouse film for a wrap. She still didn't say anything. Korathven was standing at the atrium's edge, wings fully open 3 meters, silver feathers catching the artificial sunlight through the cracked canopy. In Turai body language, fully opened wings signified either territorial display or an expression that had no direct translation. The recognition that the universe has answered a question you were afraid to ask. Korathven was not being territorial. She approached, stopped at the formal respect distance, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough that her wingspan wouldn't encroach. "I told you no aid was coming." "You did." "No signal had left this station." "You did." "And you continued." "Yes." "If they had not come," Korathven said, and her double harmonic was the sound of a Turai speaking past the limits of composure, "you would have continued still." Darian looked at her. Silver-crested, tall, robe stained with copper blood, hands carrying the memory of holding a retractor while a child screamed. "Yes, I would have." The supply tender's shuttles docked in rotation, one every 4 minutes. Within an hour, the atrium held 12 medical professionals, 3 surgical suites, a full pharmacy, and a field laboratory capable of synthesizing any compound in the Turai pharmacopoeia. The fleet tug braced the damaged port section. The frigate held its patrol, sensors sweeping. The Geddon would not return, raiders not soldiers. They struck what couldn't fight back and fled from what could. One frigate was sufficient. Earth sent one anyway along with everything else because the doctrine was not respond to the threat but resolve the situation. Threats, frigate. Casualties, hospital ship. Structural damage, tug. Supply deficits, tender. The cutter first to dock existed so whoever held the line wouldn't hold it alone 1 second longer than necessary. 2 hours later, the trauma surgeon found Darian sitting on the atrium floor, back against a planting bed, shears still in her belt. She handed her water and a ration bar and sat down. "The elder." "Stable, in recovery. Your packing kept him alive long enough for the metabolic suppression to work in his favor. Another 40 minutes without intervention, and it would have gone the other way." Darian nodded. "All 41 accounted for, 12 in surgery or post-op, 23 in treatment on the cutter, 6 stable with monitoring. The child's wing reconstruction is scheduled for tomorrow. 0 fatalities." "0, Darian repeated. 0 3-hour mass casualty event. Single paramedic, no resupply, improvised everything, ongoing hostile threat." The surgeon paused. "Your after-action report is going to be read by people who don't read after-action reports." It was a vaccination rotation. It was a vaccination rotation, and you triaged 41 casualties with a grease pencil and kept everyone alive with bedsheets and gardening tools. Darian was quiet. I ran out of everything: saline, antibiotics, anesthetic, hemostatic, sutures, bedsheets for bandages, trellises for splints, surgical glove for a chest tube, irrigation tubing for IVs. I know I saw. If you'd been another hour. We weren't. That's the system. Someone gets a fragment out and we come, all of us, everything, because the one time we bring too little is the time that matters. The archivist found Darian before the hospital ship transfers began. Formal respect distance, wings half open. I asked why you were doing this. I remember. You said because we were hurt, the whole answer. It is. The archivist's crest feathers lifted the Turai expression of a truth landing that had been circling at a distance. Among my people we have a concept that translates poorly. The closest word would be the one who stays when the flock has scattered. Not a rank, not a title, a recognition of what exists in the nature of a person, not in their station. In 600 years it has been given to a non-Turai 4 times. She paused. 5 now. She turned and walked away before Darian could respond, wings folding gently, moving to rejoin the patients being loaded onto transfer pods. Korath Ven's report to the Turai Administrative Council ran 211 pages, 47 devoted to a single human paramedic who had treated 41 casualties with a field kit, bedsheets, trellises, gardening shears, irrigation tubing, and a grease pencil. The final paragraph, in translation: the Human Medical Service has requested our formal assessment of Specialist Darian's performance. In Turai custom, assessment of this nature requires the evaluator to state plainly whether the individual acted beyond the reasonable expectation of their role. My assessment: Specialist Darian did not act beyond expectation. She acted as if no other standard existed. I do not know what to do with this information. I am told that her people consider this routine. Earth's core filed the report under Standard Operating Procedure, Category, Mass Casualty Event, Subcategory, Solo Provider, Extended Duration, Hostile Environment. 9th report in that subcategory for the fiscal year. No commendation. Commendations were for exceptional performance. Darian's performance was what the Corps expected. 3 weeks later, the Turai Council asked whether Earth was aware that its paramedics operated, by Turai standards, at a level their own emergency physicians did not reach. 2 sentences: we are aware, we train them that way. Korath Ven read it in her rebuilt office, surrounded by new seedlings. Read it twice. Folded her crest, closed the file, and stood at her viewport watching the empty space where the Resolute Mercy had been. 5 ships gone, scattered across a sector of 11,000 stations to the next signal, the next fragment, the next station that needed them. 5 ships that arrived because a hauler's panicked fragment was enough. 5 ships packed for a disaster 3 times the size they found. Staffed by people who called what Darian did routine. She thought about the young soldier flying again, the elder sitting up reading, the child with the reconstructed wing learning to spread it in the hospital ship's physical therapy bay, the child whose fragment Darian extracted without anesthetic, running through repaired corridors, laughing in 2-tone harmonics. She thought about the grease pencil, green, yellow, red. No black. 41 patients, 0 black marks. Wings opened slowly in the empty room, the recognition. She composed 3 lines to Earth's Interstellar Medical Corps. First, a request for a permanent human medical liaison at Vane Korath. Second, a request that it be Specialist Darian. Third, the Turai phrase the archivist had used, written in the original script, untranslated. Some things lost their weight in someone else's language. The Corps approved the posting. forwarded the reassignment to Darian, who was already back on the station, having declined decompression leave. She'd unpacked the new kit, the one the hospital ship left behind, fully stocked, species calibrated, 3 times the old one's size. She'd also kept the gardening shears. When the confirmation arrived, she read it, filed it, and went to check on the elder. Her shift report: 1 routine vaccination audit, 3 follow-up wound checks, a station atmospheric systems inspection Korath Ven had requested because you seem to have an opinion about emergency preparedness that I find I would like to hear. Under notable events, Darian wrote none. She saved the file and moved to the next patient,